Chapter 20 of Septimus by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 20. Septimus walked back to his club after his dinner with Zora, blessing his stars for two reasons. First, because a gracious providence had restored him to favour in his goddess's sight, and secondly, because he had escaped without telling her of the sundered lives of Emmy and himself. By the time he went to bed, however, having pondered for some hours over the interdependent relations between Zora, Cypher, Emmy, and himself, he had entangled his mind into a condition of intricate complication. He longed to continue to sun himself in the presence of his divinity. But, being a married man, no matter how nominally, too much sunning appeared reprehensible. He had also arranged for the sunning of Clem Cypher, and was aware of the indelicacy of two going through this delicious process at the same time. He also dreaded the possible incredulity of Zora when he should urge the ferociousness of his domestic demeanour as the reason for his living apart from his wife. The consequence was that after a sleepless night he bolted like a rabbit to his burrow at Nunsmere. At any rate, the mission of the dog's tail was accomplished. His bolt took place on Friday. On Saturday morning he was awakened by Wiggleswick. The latter's attire was not that of the perfect valet. He wore an old coloured shirt open at the throat, a pair of trousers hitched up to his shoulder blades by mean of a pair of red braces, and a pair of dilapidated carpet slippers. "Here's a letter." "Oh, posted," said Septimus sleepily. "You haven't written it. The missus has written it. It has a French stamp and the Paris postmark. You'd better read it." He put it on his master's pillow and went to the window to admire the view. Septimus, aroused, read the letter. It was from Emmy. It ran: "Dearest Septimus, I can't stand this loneliness in Paris any longer. I can't. If you were here and I could see you even once a week, I shouldn't mind. But to go on day after day indefinitely without a comforting word from you is more than I can bear. You say the flat is ready. I'm coming over at once with baby and Madame Boulevard, who swears she will never leave me. How she's going to get on in London without a word of English, I don't know. I don't mind if I meet Zora. Perhaps it will be better for you that I should. And I think it will be quite safe for me now. Don't hate me and think me horrid and selfish, my dear Septimus, but I do want you. I do. Thanks for the toy train. Baby enjoys the paint on the carriages so much, but Madame Boulevard says it isn't good for him. Dear, if I thought you wouldn't forgive me for being such a worry, I wouldn't worry you. Your always grateful, Emmy. Septimus lit the half-smoked pipe of the night before that lay on the coverlet, and becoming aware of Wiggleswick, disturbed his contemplation of nature by asking him if he had ever been married. "What?" asked Wiggleswick, in the unmodulated tone of the deaf. "Have you ever been married, Wiggleswick?" "Heaps of times," said the old man. "Dear me," said Septimus. "Did you commit bigamy?" "Bigamy? No, I buried 'em all honourable." "That," said Septimus, "was very kind of you." "It was out of gratitude." "For their goodness?" "No, for being delivered from 'em. I had a lot of experience before I could learn the blessedness of a single life." Septimus sighed. "Yet it must be very nice to have a wife, Wiggleswick." "But ain't you got one?" bawled the disreputable body-servant. Of course," said Septimus hurriedly. I was thinking of the people who hadn't." Wiggleswick approached his master's bedside with a mysteriously confidential air. "Don't you think we're all cosy and comfortable here, sir?" "Yes," said Septimus dubiously. "Well, I for one have nothing to complain of. The victual is good, one sleeps warm, and one has one's beer and baccy regular. What more does a man want? Not women. Women's a regrettable incident." "Aren't you cold standing there in your shirt-sleeves, Wiggleswick?" asked Septimus in his hesitating way. Wiggleswick ignored the delicacy of the situation. "Cold? No. If I was cold, I'd precious soon make myself warm. Which I wish to remark, Mr. Dix, that now you've parted with the Mrs. Pro Tem, don't you think it's more cosy and comfortable? I don't say but if she came here I'd do me best willingly. I know me duty. But, sir, a woman, what with her dusting and cleaning and washing of herself in hot water and putting flowers in mugs, do upset things terrible. I've been married oftener than you. I know 'em. Don't you think we get on better, the two of us, as we are?" "We get on very nicely," said Septimus politely, "but I'm afraid you'll have to do some cleaning and dusting today. I'm awfully sorry to trouble you. Mrs. Middlemiss has returned to England and may be down this afternoon." A look of dismay came over Wiggleswick's crafty, weather-beaten face. "Well, I'm jiggered. I'm just jiggered," said he. "I'm delighted to hear it," murmured Septimus. "Bring me my shaving water." "Are you going to get up?" asked Wiggleswick, in a tone of disgusted incredulity. "Yes." "Then you'll be wanting breakfast." "Oh, no," said Septimus, with the wan smile that sometimes flickered over his features. "Afternoon tea will do, with some bacon and eggs and things." The old man went out grumbling, and Septimus turned to his letter. It was very kind of Emmy, he thought, to write to him so affectionately. He spent the mild autumn morning on the common, consulting the ducks in the pond, and seeking inspiration from the lame donkey, his state of mind being still complicated. The more he reflected on Emmy's letter, and on Wiggleswick's views on women, the less did he agree with Wiggleswick. He missed Emmy, who had treated him very tenderly since their talk in the moonlight at Hautetot-sur-Mer, and he missed the boy, who, in the later days in Paris after her return, had conceived an infantile infatuation for him, and would cease crying or go to sleep peacefully if only he could gather a clump of Septimus's hair in his tiny fingers. He missed 1,000 gossamer trifles, each one so imperceptible, all added together so significant. He was not in the least cosy and comfortable with his old villain of a serving man. Thus he looked forward, in his twilight way, to Emmy's coming. He would live perhaps sometimes in Nunsmere and sometimes in London. Quite lately, on visiting his bankers in order to make arrangements for the disposal of his income, he was surprised to find how rich he was. And the manager, an astoundingly well-informed person, explained that a commercial concern in which he held many shares had reached such a pitch of prosperity as to treble his dividends. He went away with the vague notion that commercial companies were models of altruistic generosity. The main point, however, made clear by the exceptionally intelligent manager, being that he was richer by several hundreds a year, he began to dream of a more resplendent residence for Emmy and the boy than the little flat in Chelsea. He had observed that there were very nice houses in Berkeley Square. He wondered how much a year they were with rates and taxes. For himself he could perch in any attic close by. He resolved to discuss Berkeley Square with Emmy as soon as she arrived. William Octavius Oldreeve Dix, Member of Parliament, ought to start life in proper surroundings. Clem Cypher, down for the weekend at Penton Court, burst in upon him during the afternoon. He came with exciting news. The high official in the Ordnance Department of the War Office had written to him that morning to the effect that he was so greatly impressed by the new quick-firing gun that he proposed to experiment forthwith, and desired to be put in communication with the inventor. "That's very nice," said Septimus, "but shall I have to go and see him?" "Of course," cried Septimus. "You'll have to interview boards and gunners and engineers and superintend experiments. You'll be a person of tremendous importance." "Oh dear," said Septimus, I couldn't really." He was panic-stricken at the notion. "You'll have to," laughed Cypher. Septimus clutched at straws. "I'm afraid I shall be too busy. Emmy's coming to London, and there's the boy's education. You see, he has to go to Cambridge. Look here," he added, a brilliant idea occurring to him. "I'm fearfully rich. I don't want any more money. I'll sell you the thing outright for the £200 you advanced me, and then I shan't have anything more to do with it." "I think before you make any proposals of the kind you ought to consult Mrs. Dix," said Cypher with a laugh. "Or Zora?" "Or Zora," said Cypher. "She came down by the same train as I did. I told her the good news. She was delighted." He did not inform Septimus that, for all her delight, Zora had been somewhat sceptical. She loved Septimus, she admitted, but his effectuality in any sphere of human endeavour was unimaginable. Could anything good come out of it, Nazareth? About half an hour later the goddess herself arrived, shown in by Wiggleswick, who had been snatching the pipe of the overdriven by the front gate. She looked flushed, resolute, indignant, and on seeing Cypher she paused for a second on the threshold. Then she entered. Cypher took up his hat and stick. "No, no, you had better stay. You may help us. I suppose you know all about it." Septimus's heart sank. He knew what "it" meant. "Yes, Cypher knows. I told him." "But why didn't you tell me, dear Septimus, instead of letting me hear it from my mother and cousin Jane? I don't think it was loyal to me." "I forgot," said Septimus in desperation. "You see, I sometimes remember it and sometimes forget it. I'm not used to getting married. Wiggleswick has been married several times. He was giving me a lot of advice this morning." "Anyhow, it's true?" asked Sora, disregarding Wiggleswick. "Oh, yes. You see, my ungovernable temper—" "Your what?" It was no use. On receiving the announcement, she looked just as he had expected her to look. He tried to stammer out his catalogue of infamies, but failed. She burst out laughing, and Cypher, who knew all and was anxiously wondering how to save this situation, laughed too. "My poor dear Septimus," she said kindly, "I don't believe a word of it. The woman who couldn't get on with you must be a virago. I don't care whether she's my own sister or not. She's treating you abominably." But indeed she's not," pleaded poor Septimus. "We're the best of friends. I really want to live like this. I do. I can't live without Wiggleswick. See how cosy and comfortable he makes me." Zora looked round, and the cosiness and comfort made her gasp. Cobwebs hung from the old oak beams across the ceiling. A day or two's ashes defiled the grate. The windows were splashed with mud and rain. There were no curtains. Her finger drawn along the green baize tablecloth revealed the dust. A pair of silver candlesticks on the mantelpiece was stained an iridescent brown. The mirror was fly-blown. In the corner of the room a tray held the remains of the last meal, and a plate containing broken food had overflowed onto a neighbouring chair. An odd unclean boot lay like a frowsy drunken visitor on the floor. The springs of the armchair on which he sat were broken. "It's not fit for a pig to live in," she declared. "It's a crime to leave you to that worthless old scoundrel. I'll talk to him before I go. He won't like it. And then I'll write to Emmy. If that has no effect, I'll go over to Paris and bring her to her senses." She had arrived royally indignant, having had a pitched battle with cousin Jane, who took Emmy's side and alluded to Septimus in terms of withering contempt. Now she was furiously angry. The two men looked at her with wistful adoration, for when Zora was furious in a good cause, she was very beautiful. And the adoration in each man's heart was intensified by the consciousness of the pathetic futility of her noble rage. It was for her own sake that the situation had arisen over which she made such a pother, and she was gloriously unconscious of it. Cypher could not speak, lest he should betray his knowledge of Septimus's secret, and Septimus could only murmur incoherent ineffectualities concerning the perfection of Emmy, the worthlessness of himself, and the diamond soul that lodged in Wiggleswick's forbidding body. Zora would not listen to unreason. It was Emmy's duty to save her husband from the dust and ashes of his present cosiness, if she could do nothing else for him, and she, Zora, in her magnificence, was going to see that Emmy's duty was performed. Instead of writing, she would start the next morning for Paris. It would be well if Septimus could accompany her. "Mrs. Dix is coming to London, I believe," said Cypher. Zora looked inquiringly at Septimus, who explained discursively. Zora renounced Paris. She would wait for Emmy. For the time being the incident was closed. Septimus, in his hospitality, offered tea. "I'll get it for you," said Zora. "It will be a good opportunity to speak sweetly to Wiggleswick." She swept out of the room. The two men lit cigarettes and smoked for a while in silence. At last Cypher asked, "What made you send her the tail of the little dog?" Septimus reddened and ran two of the fingers of the hand holding the cigarette up his hair and spilled half an inch of ash on his head. I broke the dog, you see," he explained luminously. I knocked it off the mantelpiece. I'm always doing it. When Emmy has a decent house, I'll invent something to keep dogs and things on mantelpieces." Cypher said, "Do you know, you've done me one of those services which one man rarely does for another. I'll never forget it to my dying day. By bringing her to me, you've saved my reason. You've made me a different being. I'm Clem Cypher, but by God, you're the friend of humanity." Septimus looked at him with his terrified expression of a medieval wrongdoer writhing under an ecclesiastical curse. He made abject apology. "It was the only thing I could do," said he. "Of course it was, and that's why you did it. I never dreamed when you told me to wait until I saw her before going mad or breaking my heart that you meant to send for her. It has set me in front of a new universe." He rose and stretched his large limbs and smiled confidently at the world out of his clear blue eyes. Two little words of Zora had inspired him with the old self-reliance and sense of predestination to great things. Out of her own mouth had come the words, which, when they had come out of Rattenden's, had made his heart sink in despair. She had called him a big man. Like many big men, he was superstitious. He believed Rattenden's prophetic utterance concerning Zora. He was indeed set in front of a new universe, and Septimus had done it by means of the tail of a little china dog. As he was stretching himself, Wiggleswick shambled in, with the fear of Zora written on his wrinkled brow, and removed the tray and the plate of broken victuals. What had passed between them neither he nor Zora would afterwards relate, but Wiggleswick spent the whole of that night and the following days in unremitting industry, so that the house became spick and span as his own well-remembered prison cells. There also was a light of triumph in Zora's eyes when she entered a few moments afterwards with the tea-tray, which caused Cypher to smile, and a wicked feeling of content to enter Septimus's mild bosom. "I think it was high time I came home," she remarked, pouring out the tea. The two men supported the proposition. The Western Hemisphere, where she had tarried so long, could get on very well by itself. In the meantime, the old Eastern Hemisphere had been going to pieces. They had a gay little meal. Now that Zora had settled Wiggleswick, arranged her plan of campaign against Emmy, and established very agreeable and subtle relations between Cypher and herself, she could afford to shed all her charm and gaiety and graciousness on her subjects. She was infinitely glad to be with them again. Dunsmuir had unaccountably expanded. She breathed freely, and no longer knocked her head against beams in bedroom ceilings. She rallied Septimus on his new gun. "He's afraid of it," said Cypher. "What? Afraid of its going off?" she laughed. "Oh, no," said Septimus. "I've heard lots of them go off." "When?" asked Sora. Septimus reddened, and for once was at a loss for one of the curiously evasive answers in which his timidity took refuge. He fidgeted in his chair. Zora repeated her jesting question. "Was it when they were firing royal salutes in St. James's Park?" "No," said Septimus. His back being against the fading light, she could not perceive the discomfiture on his face. She longed to elicit some fantastic irrelevance. "Well, where was it? Why this mystery?" "I'll tell you two," said Septimus. "I've never told you before. In fact, I've never told anyone, not even Wiggleswick. I don't like to think of it. It hurts. You may have wondered how I ever got any practical acquaintance with gunnery. I once held a commission in the militia garrison artillery. That's how I came to love guns." "But why should that pain you, my dear Septimus?" asked Sora. "They said I was incompetent," he murmured brokenly, "and took away my commission. Colonel said I was a disgrace to the service." Clem Cypher smote the arm of his chair and started up in his wrath. "By heavens, I'll make the blundering idiot eat his words. I'll ram them down his throat with the cleaner of the new gun. I'll make you the biggest ornament the service ever possessed. I'll devote my existence to it. The Dick's gun shall wipe humanity off the face of the earth." "I don't want it to do that," said Septimus meekly. Zora begged his forgiveness very sweetly for her indiscretion, and having comforted him with glowing prophecies of fame and domestic happiness, went home with a full heart. She loved Cypher for his generous outburst. She was deeply touched by Septimus's tragic story, but having a sense of humour, she could not repress a smile at the thought of Septimus in uniform handling a battery of artillery. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Septimus by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 21. Cousin Jane was for packing her boxes and departing, but Zora bade her remain until her own plans were settled. As soon as Emmy arrived, she would have to go to London and play fairy godmother, a proceeding which might take up considerable time. Mrs. Oldreeve commended her beneficent intention, and besought her to bring the irreligiously wedded pair to the vicar, and have them wedded in a respectable Anglican way. She was firmly convinced that if this were done, nothing more could possibly be heard of separate lives. Zora promised to do her best, but Cousin Jane continued to sniff. It would be far better, she declared, to shut the man up in an idiot asylum and bring Emmy to Nunsmere, where the child could have a decent upbringing. Zora dissented loftily, but declined to be led into a profitless argument. "All I ask of you, my dear Jane," said she, "is to take care of mother a little longer, while I do what I consider my duty." She did not inform Cousin Jane that a certain freedom of movements was also rendered desirable by what she considered her duty to Clem Cypher. Cousin Jane lacked the finer threads of apprehension, and her comments might have been crude. When Zora announced her intention to Cypher of leading a migratory existence between London and Nunsmere for the sakes of Emmy and himself, he burst into a panegyric on her angelic nature. Her presence would irradiate these last dark days of disaster, for the time was quickly approaching when the Bermondsey factory would be closed down, and Cypher's cure would fade away from the knowledge of men. "Have you thought of the future, of what you are going to do?" she asked. "No," said he, "but I have faith in my destiny." Zora felt this to be magnificent, but scarcely practical. "You'll be without resources." "I never realized how full empty pockets could be," he declared. They were walking across the common, Cypher having lunched at the Nook. Presently they came across Septimus sitting by the pond. He rose and greeted them. He wore an overcoat buttoned up to the throat and a cloth cap. Zora's quick eyes noted an absence of detail in his attire. "Why, you're not dressed. Oh, you do want a wife to look after you." "I've only just got up," he explained, "and Wiggleswick wanted to do up my bedroom, so I hadn't time to find my studs. I was thinking all night, you see, and one can't think and sleep at the same time." "A new invention?" laughed Zora. "No, the old ones. I was trying to count them up. I've taken out about 50 patents, and there are heaps of things half worked out which might be valuable. Now I was thinking that if I made them all over to Cypher, he might get in some practical fellow to set them right, and start companies and things to work them, and so make a lot of money." He took off his cap and ran his hand up his hair. "There's also the new gun. I do wish you'd had that too," he added anxiously. "In fact, it was only our talk yesterday that put the other idea into my head." Cypher clapped him on the shoulder and called him his dear, generous fellow. But how could he accept? "They're not all rot," said Septimus pleadingly. "There's a patent corkscrew which works beautifully. Wiggleswick always uses it." Cypher laughed. "Well, I'll tell you what we can do. We can get a syndicate together to run the Dick's inventions and pay you royalties on sales." "That seems a very good idea," said Zora judiciously. But Septimus looked dissatisfied. "I wanted to give them to Cypher," said he. Zora reminded him laughingly that he would have to provide for the future Member of Parliament's election expenses. The royalties would come in handy. She could not take Septimus's inventions seriously. But Cypher spoke of them later in his enthusiastic way. "Who knows? There may be things hidden among his models and specifications of enormous commercial value. Lots of inventions are crazy, but some are bound to be practical. This field gun, for instance. The genius who could have hit on that is capable of inventing anything. Why shouldn't I devote my life to spreading the Dick's inventions over the earth? It's a colossal idea. Not one invention, but 50, from a corkscrew to a machine gun. It's better than Cypher's cure, isn't it?" She glanced swiftly at him to see whether the last words were spoken in bitterness. They were not. His face beamed as it had beamed in the days when he had rhapsodied over the vision of an earth, one scab, to be healed by Cypher's cure. "Say you think it's better?" he urged. "Yes, it's better," she assented, "but it's chimerical." "So are all the dreams ever dreamed by man. I shouldn't like to pass my life without dreams, Zora. I could give up tobacco and alcohol and clean collars and servants. and everything you could think of, but not dreams. Without them, the earth is just a sort of a backyard of a place." "And with them?" said Zora. "An infinite garden." "I'm afraid you'll be disillusioned over poor Septimus," she said, "but I shouldn't like you to take up anything you didn't believe in. What would be quite honest in another man wouldn't be honest in you." "That means," said Cypher, "you wouldn't like to see me going on dealing in quack medicines?" Zora flushed red. "It was at the back of my mind," she confessed, "but I did put my thoughts into the form of a compliment." "Zora," said he, "if I fell below what I wanted to appear in your eyes, I should lose the dearest dream of all." In the evening came Septimus to Penton Court to discuss the new scheme with Cypher. Wiggleswick, with the fear of Zora heavy upon him, had laid out his master's dinner suit, and Septimus had meekly put it on. He had also dined in a Christian fashion, for the old villain could cook a plain dinner creditably when he chose. Septimus proclaimed the regeneration of his body-servant as one of the innumerable debts he owed to Sora. "Why do you repay them to me?" asked Cypher. Then he rose, laughed into the distressed face, and put both his hands on Septimus's shoulders. "No, don't try to answer. I know more about you than you can possibly conceive, and to me you're transparency itself. But you see that I can't accept your patents, don't you?" "I shall never do anything with them." "Have you tried?" "No." "Then I will. It will be a partnership between my business knowledge and energy and your brains. That will be right and honourable for the two of us." Septimus yielded. "If both you and Zora think so, it must be," he said. But in his heart he was disappointed. A few days afterwards Shuttleworth came into Cypher's office with an expression of cheerfulness on his dismal countenance. "Can I have a few moments with you, sir?" Cypher bade him be seated. Since his defection to the enemy, Shuttleworth had avoided his chief as much as possible, the excess of sorrow over anger in the latter's demeanour toward him being hard to bear. He had slunk about, not daring to meet his eyes. This morning, however, he reeked of conscious virtue. "I have a proposal to put before you, sir, with which I think you'll be pleased," said he. "I'm glad to hear it," said Cypher. "I'm proud to say," continued Shuttleworth, "that it was my suggestion and that I've carried it through. I was anxious to show you that I wasn't ungrateful for all your past kindnesses, and my leaving you was not as disloyal as you may have thought." "I never accuse you of disloyalty," said Cypher. "You had your wife and children. You did the only thing possible." "You take a load off my mind," said Shuttleworth. He drew a long breath as though relieved from an intolerable burden. "What is your proposal?" asked Cypher. "I am authorised by the Jabosa Jones Company to approach you with regard to a most advantageous arrangement for both parties. It's your present intention to close down the factory and shut up this office as soon as things can be wound up." "That's my intention," said Cypher. "You'll come out of it solvent with just £1,000 or so in your pocket. The cure will disappear from the face of the earth." "Quite so," said Cypher. He leaned back in his chair and held an ivory paper-knife in both hands. "But wouldn't that be an enormous pity?" said Shuttleworth. "The cure is known far and wide. Economically financed and put more or less out of reach of competition, it can still be a most valuable property. Now, it occurred to me that there was no reason why the Jabosa Jones Company could not run Cypher's cure side by side with the cuticle remedy. They agree with me. They are willing to come to terms whereby they will take over the whole concern as it stands, with your name, of course, and advertisements and trademarks, and pay you a percentage of the profits." Cypher made no reply. The ivory paper-knife snapped, and he laid the pieces absently on his desk. "The advantage to you is obvious," remarked Shuttleworth, who was beginning to grow uneasy before the sphinx-like attitude of his chief. "Quite obvious," said Cypher. Then, after a pause, "Do they propose to ask me to manage the Cypher Cure branch?" The irony was lost on Shuttleworth. "No, well, not exactly," he stammered. Cypher laughed grimly and checked further explanations. "That was a joke, Shuttleworth. Haven't you noticed that my jokes are always rather subtle? No, of course you are to manage the cure.
"Oh, I know nothing about that, sir," said Shuttleworth hastily. Cypher rose and walked about the room, saying nothing, and his manager followed him anxiously with his eyes. Presently he paused before the cartoon of the famous poster. "This would be taken over with the rest?" "I suppose so. It's a valuable part of the goodwill." "And the model of Edinburgh Castle, and the autograph testimonials, and the Clem Cypher Friend of Humanity?" "The model isn't much use. Of course you could keep that as a curiosity."
"In the middle of my drawing-room table," said Cypher ironically.
Shuttleworth smiled, guessing that the remark was humorous. "Well," he said, "that's as you please, but the name and title naturally are the essence of the matter."
"I see," said Cypher. "Clem Cypher Friend of Humanity is the essence of the matter."
"With the secret recipe, of course."
"Of course," said Cypher absently.
He paced the room once or twice, then halted in front of Shuttleworth, looked at him fixedly for a second or two out of his clear eyes, and resumed his walk, which was disconcerting for Shuttleworth, who wiped his spectacles. "Do you think we might now go into some detail with regard to terms?"
"No," said Cypher, stopping short of the fireplace. "I don't. I've got to agree to the principle first."
"But surely there's no difficulty about that," cried Shuttleworth, rising in consternation. "I can see no earthly reason—"
"I don't suppose you can," said Cypher. "When do you want an answer?"
"As soon as possible."
"Come to me in an hour's time, and I'll give it you."
Shuttleworth retired. Cypher sat at his desk, his chin in his hand, and struggled with his soul, which, as all the world knows, is the most uncomfortable thing a man has to harbour in his bosom. After a few minutes he rang up a number on the telephone.
"Are you the Shaftesbury Club? Is Mr. Septimus Dix in?"
He knew that Septimus was staying at the club, as he had come to town to meet Emmy, who had arrived the evening before from Paris. Mr. Dix was in. He was just finishing breakfast and would come to the telephone.
Cypher waited with his ear to the receiver. "Is that you, Septimus? It's Clem Cypher speaking. I want you to come to Moorgate Street at once. It's a matter of immediate urgency. Get into a hansom and tell the man to drive like the devil. Thanks."
He resumed his position and sat motionless until, about half an hour later, Septimus, very much scared, was shown into the room.
"I felt sure you were in. I felt sure you would come. There's a destiny about all this business, and I seem to have a peep into it. I'm going to make myself the damnedest fool of all creative beings. The very damnedest."
Septimus murmured that he was sorry to hear it.
"I hoped you might be glad," said Cypher.
"It depends upon the kind of fool you're going to make of yourself," cried Septimus, a ray of wonderful lucidity flashing across his mind. "There's a couplet of Tennyson's— I don't read poetry, you know," he broke off apologetically, "except a little Persian. I'm a hard scientific person, all machinery. My father used to throw poetry books into the fire if he caught me with one, but my mother used to read to me now and then. Oh, yes, Tennyson. It goes, 'They called me in the public squares, the fool that wears a crown of thorn.' That's the best kind of a fool to be." He suddenly looked round. "Dear me, I left my umbrella in the cab. That's the worst kind of a fool to be." He smiled wanly, dropped his bowler hat on the floor, and eventually sat down.
"I wanted to tell you something," said Cypher, standing on the hearthrug with his hands on his hips. "I've just had an offer from the Jebusa Jones Company."
Septimus listened intently while he told the story, wondering greatly why he, of all unbusinesslike, unpractical people, in spite of his friendship with Cypher, should be summoned so urgently to hear it. If he had suspected that in reality he was playing the part of an animated conscience, he would have shrivelled up through fright and confusion.
Said Cypher, "If I accept this offer, I shall have a fair income for the rest of my days. I can go where I like and do what I like. Not a soul can call my commercial honesty in question. No business man in his senses would refuse it. If I decline, I start the world again with empty pockets. What shall I do? Tell me."
"I," said Septimus with his usual gesture of diffidence, "I'm such a silly ass at such things."
"Never mind," said Cypher. "I'll do just what you would do."
Septimus reflected and said hesitatingly, "I think I should do what Zora would like. She doesn't mind empty pockets." Cypher dashed his hand across his forehead and broke into a loud cry. "I knew you would say that. I brought you here to say it. Thank God. I love her, Septimus. I love her with every fibre in me. If I had sold my name to these people, I should have sold my honour. I'd have sold my birthright for a mess of pottage. I couldn't have looked her in the face again. Whether she will marry me or not has nothing to do with it. It would have had nothing to do with it in your case. You would have been the best kind of fool, and so shall I." He swung about the room, greatly excited, his ebullient nature finding in words relief from past tension. He laughed aloud, proclaimed his love for Zora, shook his somewhat bewildered friend by the hand, and informed him that he, Septimus, alone of mortals, was responsible for the great decision. And while Septimus wondered what the deuce he meant, he rang the bell and summoned Shuttleworth. The dismal manager entered the room. On seeing Cypher's cheery face, his own brightened. "I've thought the matter over, Shuttleworth."
"And you've decided?"
"To refuse the offer, absolutely."
The manager gasped. "But, Mr. Cypher, have you reflected—"
"My good Shuttleworth," said Cypher, "in all the years we've worked together, have you ever known me to say I've made up my mind when I haven't?" Shuttleworth marched out of the room and banged the door, and went forth to declare to the world his opinion of Clem Cypher. He had always been half crazy. Now he had gone stark, staring, raving, biting mad. And those to whom he told the tale agreed with him. But Cypher laughed his great laugh. "Poor Shuttleworth! He has worked hard to bring off this deal. I'm sorry for him, but one can't serve God and Mammon." Septimus rose and took his hat. "I think it's awfully wonderful of you," he said. "I really do. I should like to talk to you about it, but I must go and see Emmy. She came last night." Cypher inquired politely after her health, also that of her baby. "He's taking such a deuce of a time to grow up," said Septimus. "Otherwise he's well. He's got a tooth. I've been wondering why no dentist has ever invented a set of false teeth for babies." "Then your turn would come," laughed Cypher, "for you would have to invent them a cast iron inside." Before Septimus went, Cypher thrust a gold-headed umbrella into his hands. "It's pouring with rain, and you'll wade about and get wet through. I make a rule never to lend umbrellas, so I give you this from a grateful heart. God bless you." End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Septimus by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 22. The little flat in Chelsea, cleaned, swept, and garnished by the wife of the porter of the mansions, received Emmy, her babe, Madame Boulevard, and multitudinous luggage. All the pretty fripperies and frivolities had been freshened and refurbished since their desecration at alien hands, and the place looked cheery and homelike. But Emmy found it surprisingly small, and was amazed to discover the prodigious space taken up by the baby. When she drew Septimus's attention to this phenomenon, he accounted it for saying that it was because he had such a very big name, which was an excellent thing in that it would enable him to occupy a great deal of room in the universe when he grew up. She busied herself all the morning about the flat, happier than she had been for a whole year. Her days of hagerdom were over. The menacing shadow of the finger of scorn pointing at her from every airt of heaven had disappeared. A clear sky welcomed her, and she came back to take up an acknowledged position in the world. The sense of release from an intolerable ban outweighed the bitterness of old associations. She was at home, in London, among dear familiar things and faces. She was almost happy. When Madame Boulevard appeared with bonnet and basket, undismayedly prepared to market for lunch and dinner, she laughed like a schoolgirl, and made her repeat the list of English words she had taught her in view of this contingency. She could say cabbage, sugar, lettuce, and ask for all sorts of things. "But suppose you lose your way, Madame Boulevard?" "I shall find it, madame." "But how will you ask for directions? You know I can't say Ecclefechan Mansions." Madame Boulevard made a hopeless, spluttering sound, as if she were blowing teeth out of her mouth, which in no wise resembled the name of the place wherein she dwelt. But Madame Boulevard, as has been remarked, was a brave femme, and en donc this was the least of the difficulties she had had to encounter during her life. Emmy bade her Godspeed in her perils among the greengrocers. She went blithely about her household tasks, and sang and cooed deliciously to the child lying in its bassinet. Every now and then she looked at the clock over the mantelpiece, wondering why Septimus had not come. Only in the depths of her heart, depths which humans in their everyday life dare not sound too frequently, did she confess how foolishly she longed for him. He was late. With Emmy, Septimus never broke an appointment. To ensure his being at a certain place at a certain time to meet her, he took the most ingenious and complicated precautions. Before now, he had dressed overnight and gone to sleep in his clothes so as to be ready when the servant called him in the morning. Emmy, knowing this, after the way of women, began to grow anxious. When, therefore, she opened the flat door to him, she upbraided him with considerable tenderness. "It was Clem Cypher," he explained, taking off his overcoat. "He sent for me. He wanted me badly. Why, I don't know. At least, I do half know, but the other half I don't. He's a magnificent fellow." A little later, after Septimus had inspected her morning's work in the flat, and the night's progress in the boy's tooth, and the pretty new blouse which she put on in his honour, and the rose in her bosom taken from the bunch she had sent to greet her arrival in the flat the night before, and after he had heard of the valorous adventures of Madame Boulevard, and of a message from Egisipi Cruchot which she had forgotten to deliver overnight, and of an announcement from Zora to the effect that she would call at Ecclefechan Mansions soon after lunch, and of many things of infinite importance, Emmy asked him what Clem Cypher had been doing, and wherein lay the particular magnificence of character to which Septimus had alluded. "He's awfully splendid," said Septimus. "He's given up a fortune for the sake of an idea. He also gave me an umbrella, and his blessing. Emmy," he looked at her in sudden alarm, "did I bring an umbrella with me?" "You did, dear, and you put it in the stand, but what you've done with the blessing I don't know." "I've got it in my heart," said he. "He's a tremendous chap." Emmy's curiosity was excited. She sat on the fender seat and bent forward, her hands on her knees, in a pretty, girlish attitude, and fixed her forget-me-not eyes on him. "Tell me all about it." He obeyed, and expounded Cypher's quixotism in his roundabout fashion. He concluded by showing her how it had been done for Zora's sake. Emmy made a little gesture of impatience. "Zora?" she exclaimed jealously. "It's always Zora. To see how you men go on, one would think there was no other woman in the world. Everyone does crazy things for her, and she looks on calmly and never does a hand's turn for anybody. Clem Cypher's a jolly good sight too good for her." Septimus looked pained at the disparagement of his goddess. Emmy sprang to her feet and put her fingertips on his shoulders. "Forgive me, dear. Women are cats, I've often told you, and love to scratch even those they're fond of. Sometimes the more they love them, the harder they scratch. But I won't scratch you any more. Indeed, I won't." The sound of the latchkey was heard in the front door. "There's Madame Boulevard," she cried. "I must see what miracle of loaves and fishes she has performed. Do you mind, baby, till I come back?" She danced out of the room, and Septimus sat on a straight-backed chair beside the bassinet. The baby, he was a rather delicate child, considerably undergrown for his age, but a placid, uncomplaining little mortal, looked at Septimus out of his blue and white china eyes, and contorted his india-rubber features into a muddle indicative of pleasure, and Septimus smiled cordially at the baby. "William Octavius Oldreeve Dix," he murmured, an apostrophe which caused the future statesman a paroxysm of amusement. "I'm exceedingly glad to see you. I hope you like London. We're great friends, aren't we? And when you grow up, we're going to be greater. I don't want you to have anything to do with machinery. It stops your heart beating and makes you cold and unsympathetic and prevents women from loving you. You mustn't invent things. That's why I'm going to make you a member of Parliament, a Conservative member." William Octavius, who had been listening attentively, suddenly chuckled as if he had seen a joke. Septimus's gaze conveyed sedate reproof. "When you laugh, you show such a deuce of a lot of gum, like Wiggleswick," said he. The baby made no reply. The conversation languished. Septimus bent down to examine the tooth, and the baby clutched a tiny fistful of upstanding hair as a reaper clutches a handful of wheat. Septimus smiled and kissed the little crinkled, bubbly lips, and fell into a reverie. William Octavius went fast asleep. When Emmy returned, she caught an appealing glance from Septimus, and rescued him, a new Absalom. "You dear thing," she cried. "Why didn't you do it yourself?" "I was afraid of waking him. It's dangerous to wake babies suddenly. No, it isn't babies, it's somnambulists. But he may be one, you see, and as he can't walk, we can't tell. I wonder whether I could invent an apparatus for preventing somnambulists from doing themselves damage." Emmy laughed. "You can invent nothing so wonderful as Madame Boulevard," she cried gaily. "She's contemptuous of the dangers of English marketing. The people understood me at once," she said. "She evidently has a poor opinion of them." Septimus stayed to lunch, a pleasant meal which made them bless Egesippe Cruchot for introducing them to the aunt who could cook. So far did their gratitude go that Septimus remarked that it would only be decent to add Egesippe to the baby's name. But Emmy observed that he should have thought of that before. The boy had already been christened. It was too late. They drank the Zouave's health instead in some fearful and wonderful red wine which Madame Boulevard had procured from heaven knows what purveyor of dangerous chemicals. They thought it excellent. "I wonder," said Emmy, "whether you know what this means to me." "It's home," replied Septimus with an approving glance around the little dining-room. "You must get me a flat just like this." "Close by?" "If it's too close, I might come here too often." "Do you think that's possible?" she said, with as much wistfulness as she dare allow herself. "Besides, you have a right." Septimus explained that as a Master of Arts of the University of Cambridge he had a right to play marbles on the Senate House steps, a privilege denied by statute to persons in statu pupillarii, but that he would be locked up as a lunatic if he insisted on exercising it. After a pause, Emmy looked at him and said with sudden tragicality, "I'm not a horrible, hateful worry to you, Septimus." "Lord, no," said Septimus. "You don't wish you'd never set eyes on me?" "My dear girl," said Septimus. "And you wouldn't rather go on living quietly at Nunsmere and not bother about me any more? Do tell me the truth." Septimus's hand went to his hair. He was unversed in the ways of women. "I thought all that was settled long ago," he said. "I'm such a useless creature. You give me something to think about, and the boy, and his education, and his teeth, and he'll have whooping cough and measles and breeches and things, and it'll be frightfully interesting." Emmy, elbow on table and chin in hand, smiled at him with a touch of audacity in her forget-me-not eyes. "I believe you're more interested in the boy than you are in me." Septimus reddened and stammered, unable as usual to express his feelings. He kept to the question of interest. It's so different," said he. "I look on the boy as a kind of invention." She persisted. "And what am I?" He had one of his luminous inspirations. "You," said he, "are a discovery." Emmy laughed. "I do believe you like me a little bit, after all." "You've got such beautiful fingernails," said he. Madame Boulevard brought in the coffee. Septimus, in the act of lifting the cup from tray to table, let it fall through his nervous fingers, and the coffee streamed over the dainty tablecloth. Madame Boulevard appealed fervently to the deity, but Emmy smiled proudly, as if the spilling of coffee was a rare social accomplishment. Soon after this, Septimus went to his club with orders to return for tea, leaving Emmy to prepare for her meeting with Zora. He had offered to be present at this first interview, so as to give her his support, and corroborate whatever statement as to his turpitudes she might care to make in explanation of their decision to live apart. But Emmy preferred to fight her battle single-handed. Alone, he had saved the situation by his very vagueness. In conjunction with herself there was no knowing what he might do, for she had resolved to exonerate him from all blame, and to attribute to her own infirmities of disposition this calamitous result of their marriage. Now that the hour of meeting approached, she grew nervous. Unlike Zora, she had not inherited her father's fearlessness and joy of battle. The touch of adventurous spirit which she had received from him had been her undoing, as it had led her into temptation which the gentle, weak character derived from her mother had been powerless to resist. All her life she had been afraid of Zora, subdued by her splendid vitality, humbled before her more generous accomplishment. And now she was to fight for her honour and her child's, and at the same time for the tender chivalry of the odd, beloved creature that was her husband. She armed herself with woman's weapons and put on a brave face, though her heart thumped like some devilish machine, racking her mercilessly. The bell rang. She bent over the boy asleep in the bassinet and gave a mother's touch or two to the tiny coverlet. She heard the flat door open and Zora's rich voice inquire for Mrs. Dix. Then Zora, splendid, deep-bosomed, glowing with colour, bringing with her a perfume of furs and violets, sailed into the room and took her into her arms. Emmy felt fluffy and insignificant. "How well you're looking, dear. I declare you are prettier than ever. You've filled out. I didn't come the first thing this morning as I wanted to, because I knew you would find everything topsy-turvy in the flat. Septimus is a dear, but I haven't much faith in his domestic capabilities." "The flat was in perfect order," said Emmy. "Even that bunch of roses in a jar." "Did he remember to put in the water?" Zora laughed, meaning to be kind and generous, to make it evident to Emmy that she had not come as a violent partisan of Septimus, and to lay a pleasant, familiar foundation for the discussion in prospect. But Emmy resented the note of disparagement. "Of course he did," she said shortly. Zora flew to the bassinet and glowed womanlike over the baby. A beautiful child, one to be proud of indeed. Why hadn't Emmy dear proclaimed his uniqueness in the world of infants? From the references in her letters, he might have been the ordinary baby of every cradle. "Oh, you ought to be such a happy woman," she cried, taking off her furs and throwing them over the back of a chair. "Such a happy woman!" An involuntary sigh shook her. The first words had been intended to convey a gentle reproof. Nature had compelled the reiteration on her own account. "I'm happy enough," said Emmy. "I wish you could say that with more conviction, dear. Happy enough generally means pretty miserable." "Why should you be miserable?" "I'm not. I have more happiness than I deserve. I don't deserve much." Zora put her arm round her sister's waist. "Never mind, dear. We'll try to make you happier." Emmy submitted to the caress for a while, and then freed herself gently. She did not reply. Not all the trying of Zora and all the ladies bountiful of Christendom could give her her heart's desire. Besides, Zora, with her large air of smiling Deus ex machina, was hopelessly out of tone with her mood. She picked up the furs. "How lovely! They're new. Where did you get them?" The talk turned on ordinary topics. They had not met for a year, and they spoke of trivial happenings. Emmy touched lightly on her life in Paris. They exchanged information as to their respective journeys. Emmy had had a good crossing the day before, but Madame Bolivar, to have faced the hitherto unknown perils of the deep with unflinching courage, had been dreadfully seasick. The boy had slept most of the time. Awake, he had been as good as gold. "He's the sweetest tempered child under the sun." "Like his father," said Zora, "who is both sweet-tempered and a child." The words were a dagger in Emmy's heart. She turned away swiftly lest Zora should see the pain in her eyes. The intensity of the agony had been unforeseen. "I hope the little mite has a spice of the devil from our side of the family," added Zora, "or it will go hard with him. That's what's wrong with poor Septimus." Emmy turned with a flash. "There's nothing wrong with Septimus. I wouldn't change him for any man in the world." Zora raised surprised eyebrows and made the obvious retort. "Then, my dear, why on earth don't you live with him?" Emmy shrugged her shoulders and looked out of the window. There was a block of flats over the way, and a young woman at a window immediately opposite was also looking out. This irritated her. She resented being stared at by a young woman in a flat. She left the window and sat on the sofa. "Don't you think, Zora, you might let Septimus and myself arrange things as we think best? I assure you we are quite capable of looking after ourselves. We meet in the friendliest way possible, but we've decided to occupy separate houses. It's a matter that concerns ourselves entirely." Zora was prepared for this attitude, which she resolved not to countenance. She had come in all her bravery to bring Emmy to her senses. Emmy should be brought. She left the bassinet and sat down near her sister and smiled indulgently. "My dearest child, if you were so-called advanced people and held all sorts of outrageous views, I might understand you. But you are two very ordinary folk with no views at all. You never had any in your life, and if Septimus had one he would be so terribly afraid of it that he would chain it up. I'm quite certain you married without any idea save that of sticking together. Now why haven't you?" "I make Septimus miserable. I can't help it. So that to make him unhappy, I insist upon this arrangement. There." "Then I think you are very wicked and heartless and selfish," said Zora. "I am," said Emmy defiantly. "Your duty is to make him happy. It would take so little to do that. You ought to give him a comfortable home and teach him to realize his responsibilities towards the child." Again the stab. Emmy's nerve began to give way. For the first time came the wild notion of facing Zora with the whole disastrous story. She dismissed it as crazy. "I tell you, things can't be altered." "But why? I can't imagine you so monstrous. Give me your confidence, darling." "There's nothing to give." "I'm sure I could put things right for you at once if I knew what was wrong. If it's anything to do with Septimus," she added in her unwisdom and with a charming proprietary smile, "why, I can make him do whatever I like." "Even if we quarrelled," cried Emmy, losing control of her prudence, "do you suppose I would let you bring him back to me?" "But why not?" "Have you been so blind all this time as not to see?" Emmy knew her words were vain and dangerous, but the attitude of her sister, calm and confident, assuming her air of gracious patronage, irritated her beyond endurance. Zora's smile deepened into indulgent laughter. "My dearest Emmy, you don't mean to say that it's jealousy of me? But it's too ridiculous. Do you suppose I've ever thought of Septimus in that way?" "You thought of him just as you used to think of the bob-tailed sheep-dog we had when we were children." "Well, dear, you were never jealous of my attachment to Bobby or Bobby's devotion to me," said Zora, smilingly logical. "Come, dear, I knew there was only some silly nonsense at the bottom of this. Look, I'll resign every right I have in poor Septimus." Emmy rose. "If you call him poor Septimus and speak of him in that tone, you'll drive me mad. It's you that are wicked and heartless and selfish." "I?" cried Zora, aghast. "Yes, you. You accept the love and adoration of the noblest gentleman that God ever put into the world, and you treat him and talk of him as if he were a creature of no account. If you were worthy of being loved by him, I shouldn't be jealous, but you're not. You've been so wrapped up in your own magnificence that you've not even condescended to notice that he loved you. And even now, when I tell you, you laugh as if it were preposterous that poor Septimus could ever dare to love you. You drive me mad." Zora drew herself up angrily. To make allowances for a silly girl's jealousy was one thing. It was another to be accused in this vehement fashion. Conscious of her innocence, she said, "Your attack on me is entirely unjustifiable, Emmy. I have done nothing." "That's why," retorted Emmy quickly. "You've done nothing. Men are sacrificing their lives and fortunes for you, and you do nothing." "Lives and fortunes? What do you mean?" "I mean what I say," cried Emmy desperately. "Septimus has done everything short of laying down his life for you. That he would have done if necessary, and you haven't even taken the trouble to see the soul in the man that was capable of it. And now that something has happened which you can't help seeing, you come in your grand way to put it all to rights in a minute. You think I've turned him out because he's a good-natured worry like Bobby the bob-tailed sheep-dog, and you say, 'Poor fellow, see how pitifully he's wagging his tail. It's cruel of you not to let him in.' That's the way you look at Septimus, and I can't stand it, and I won't. I love him as I never dreamed a woman could love a man. I could tear myself into little pieces for him bit by bit. And I can't get him. He's as far removed from me as the stars in heaven. You could never understand. I pray every night to God to forgive me and to work a miracle and bring him to me. But miracles don't happen. He'll never come to me. He can't come to me. While you have been patronizing him, patting him on the head, playing Lady Bountiful to him, as you are doing to the other man who's given up a fortune this very morning just because he loves you, while you've been doing this and despising him. Yes, you know you do in your heart, for a simple, good-natured, half-witted creature who amuses himself with crazy inventions. He has done a thing to save you from pain and shame and sorrow. You, not me, because he loved you. And now I love him. I would give all I have in life for the miracle to happen, but it can't. Don't you understand? It can't." She stood panting in front of Zora, a passionate woman obeying elemental laws. And when passionate women obey elemental laws, they are reckless in speech and overwhelming in assertion and denunciation. Emmy was the first whom Zora had encountered. She was bewildered by the storm of words and could only say, rather stupidly, "Why can't it?" Emmy drew 2 or 3 short breaths. The notion had come again. The temptation was irresistible. Zora should know, having brought it on herself. She opened the door. "Madame Boulevard!" she cried, and when the Frenchwoman appeared she pointed to the bassinet. "Take baby into the bedroom. It will be better for him there." "Bien, madame," said Madame Boulevard, taking up the child. And when the door had closed behind her, Emmy pointed to it and said, "That's why." Zora started forward, horror-stricken. "Emmy, what do you mean?" "I'll tell you. I couldn't with him in the room. I should always fancy that he had heard me, and I want him to respect and love his mother." "Emmy," cried Zora. "Emmy, what are you saying? Your son not respect you, if he knew? What do you mean?" "Yes," said Emmy, "I do. Septimus went through the marriage ceremony with me and gave us his name. That's why we are living apart. Now you know." "My God," said Zora. "Do you remember the last night I was at Nunsmere?" "Yes, you fainted." "I'd seen the announcement of the man's marriage in the newspaper." She told her story briefly and defiantly, asking for no sympathy, proclaiming it all ad majorem septimi gloriam. Zora sat looking at her, paralyzed with helplessness, like one who, having gone lightly forth to shoot rabbits, suddenly comes upon a lion. "Why didn't you tell me at the time, before? Did you ever encourage me to give you my confidence? You patted me on the head too, and never concerned yourself about my affairs. I was afraid of you, deadly afraid of you. It sounds rather silly now, doesn't it? But I was." Zora made no protest against the accusation. She sat quite still, her eyes fixed on the foot of the bassinet, adjusting her soul to new and startling conceptions. She said in a whisper, "My God, what a fool I've been!" The words lingered a haunting echo in her ears. They were mockingly familiar. Where had she heard them recently? Suddenly she remembered. She raised her head and glanced at Emmy in anything but a proud way. "You said something just now about Clem Cypher having sacrificed a fortune for me. What was it? I'd better hear everything." Emmy sat on the fender stool, as she had done when Septimus had told her the story, and repeated it for Zora's benefit. "You say he sent for Septimus this morning?" said Zora in a low voice. "Do you think he knows about you two?" "It is possible that he guesses," replied Emmy, to whom Hegesippus Crucio's indiscretion had been reported. "Septimus has not told him." "I ask," said Zora, "because since my return he has seemed to look on Septimus as a sort of inspired creature. I begin to see things I never saw before." There was silence. Emmy gripped the mantelpiece, and, head on arm, looked into the fire. Zora sat lost in her expanding vision. Presently Emmy said, without turning round, "You mustn't turn away from me now, for Septimus's sake. He loves the boy as if he were his own. Whatever wrong I've done, I've suffered for it. Once I was a frivolous, unbalanced, unprincipled little fool. I'm a woman now, and a good woman, thanks to him. To live in the same atmosphere as that exquisite delicacy of soul is enough to make one good. No other man on earth could have done what he has done, and in the way he has done it. I can't help loving him. I can't help eating my heart out for him. That's my punishment." This time the succeeding silence was broken by a half-checked sob. Emmy started round, and beheld Zora crying silently to herself among the sofa cushions. Emmy was amazed. Zora, the magnificent, had broken down, and was weeping like any silly fool of a girl. It was real crying, not the shedding of the tears of sensibility which often stood in her generous eyes. Emmy moved gently across the room. She was a soft-hearted, affectionate woman, and knelt by the sofa. "Zora, dear." Zora, with an immense longing for love, caught her sister in her arms, and the two women wept very happily together. It was thus that Septimus, returning for tea as he was bidden, found them some while afterwards. Zora rose, her lashes still wet, and whipped up her furs. "But you're not going?" "Yes, I'll leave you two together. I'll do what I can. Septimus." She caught him by the arm and drew him a step or two towards the door. "Emmy has told me everything. Oh, you needn't look frightened, dear. I'm not going to thank you." Her voice broke on the laugh. "I should only make a fool of myself. Some other time. I only want to say, don't you think you would be more cosy and comfortable if you let her take care of you altogether? She's breaking her heart for love of you, Septimus, and she would make you happy." She rushed out of the room, and before the pair could recover from their confusion, they heard the flat door slam behind her. Emmy looked at Septimus with a great scare in her blue eyes. She said something about taking no notice of what Zora said. "But is it true?" he asked. She said with her back against the wall, "Do you think it very amazing that I should care for you?" Septimus ran his hand vehemently up his hair till it reached the climax of Struhl Peterdom. The most wonderful thing in his life had happened. A woman loved him. It upset all his preconceived notions of his place in the universe. "Yes, I do," he answered. "It makes my head spin round." He found himself close to her. "Do you mean that you love me?" His voice grew tremulous. "As if I were an ordinary man?" "No," she cried with a half laugh. "Of course I don't. How could I love an ordinary man as I love you?" Neither could tell afterwards how it happened. Emmy called the walls to witness that she did not throw herself into his arms, and Septimus's natural timidity precluded the possibility of his having seized her in his. But she stood for a long, throbbing time in his embrace, while he kissed her on the lips and gave all his heart into her keeping. They sat down together on the fender seat. "When a man does that," said Septimus, as if struck by a luminous idea, "I suppose he asks the girl to marry him." "But we are married already," she cried joyously. "Dear me," said Septimus, "so we are. I forgot. It's very puzzling, isn't it? I think, if you don't mind, I'll kiss you again." End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Septimus by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 23. Zora went straight back to her hotel sitting-room. There, without taking off her hat or furs, she wrote a swift, long letter to Clem Cypher, and, summoning the waiter, ordered him to post it at once. When he had gone, she reflected for a few moments and sent off a telegram. After a further brief period of reflection, she went downstairs and rang up Cypher's office on the telephone. The mere man would have tried the telephone first, then sent the telegram, and after that the explanatory letter. Woman has her own way of doing things. Cypher was in. He would have finished for the day in about 20 minutes. Then he would have come to her on the nearest approach to Wing's London locomotion provided. "Remember, it's something most particular that I want to see you about," said Zora. "Good-bye." She rang off and went upstairs again, removed the traces of tears from her face, and changed her dress. For a few moments she regarded her outward semblance somewhat anxiously in the glass, unconscious of a new coquetry. Then she sat down before the sitting-room fire and looked at the inner Zora Middlemist. There was never woman since the world began more cast down from her high estate. Not a shred of magnificence remained. She saw herself as the most useless, vapouring and purblind of mortals. She had gone forth from the despised Nunsmere, where nothing ever happened, to travel the world over in search of realities, and had returned to find that Nunsmere had all the time been the centre of the realities that most deeply concerned her life. While she had been talking, others had been living. The three beings whom she had honoured with her royal and somewhat condescending affection had all done great things, passed through flames and issued thence purified with love in their hearts. Emmy, Septimus, Cypher, all in their respective ways had grappled with essentials. She alone had done nothing, she the strong, the sane, the capable, the magnificent. She had been a tinsel failure. So far out of touch had she been with the real warm things of life which mattered, that she had not even gained her sister's confidence. Had she done so from her girlhood up, the miserable tragedy might not have happened. She had failed in a sister's elementary duty. As a 6 weeks' wife, what had she done save shiver with a splendid disgust? Another woman would have fought and perhaps have conquered. She had made no attempt, and the poor wretch dead, she had trumpeted abroad her crude opinion of the sex to which he belonged. At every turn she had seen it refuted. For many months she had known it to be vain and false, and nature, who with all her faults is at least not a liar, had spoken over and over again. She had raised a fine storm of argument, but nature had laughed. So had the literary man from London. She had a salutary vision of herself as the common geck and gull of the queerly assorted pair. She recognized that in order to work out any problem of life, one must accept life's postulates and axioms. Even her mother, from whose gentle lips she rarely expected to hear wisdom, had said, "I don't see how you're going to live, dear, without a man to take care of you." Her mother was right. Nature was right. Rattendom was right. She, Zora Middlemist, had been hopelessly wrong. When Cypher arrived, she welcomed him with an unaccustomed heartbeat. The masterful grip of his hands as they held hers gave her a new throb of pleasure. She glanced into his eyes and saw there the steady love of a strong, clean soul. She glanced away and hung her head, feeling unworthy. "What's this most particular thing you have to say to me?" he asked, with a smile. "I can't tell it to you like this. Let us sit down. Draw up that chair to the fire." When they were seated, she said, "I want first to ask you a question or two. Do you know why Septimus married my sister? Be quite frank, for I know everything." "Yes," he said gravely. "I knew. I found it out in one or two odd ways. Septimus hasn't the faintest idea." Zora picked up an illustrated weekly from the floor and used it as a screen, ostensibly from the fire, rarely from Cypher. "Why did you refuse the Jabusa Jones offer this morning?" "What would you have thought of me if I had accepted? But Septimus shouldn't have told you." "He didn't. He told Emmy, who told me. You did it for my sake?" "Everything I do is for your sake. You know that well enough." "Why did you send for Septimus?" "Why are you putting me through this interrogatory?" he laughed. "You will learn soon," said Zora. "I want to get everything clear in my mind. I've had a great shock. I feel as if I've been beaten all over. For the first time I recognize the truth of the proverb about a woman, a dog, and a walnut tree. Why did you send for Septimus?" Cypher leaned back in his chair, and as the illustrated paper prevented him from seeing Zora's face, he looked reflectively at the fire. "I've always told you that I am superstitious. Septimus seems to be gifted with an unconscious sense of right in an infinitely higher degree than any man I've ever known. His dealings with Emmy showed it. His sending for you to help me showed it. He's shown it in 1,000 ways. If it hadn't been for him and his influence on my mind, I don't think I should have come to that decision. When I come to it, I just wanted him. Why, I can't tell you." "I suppose you knew that he was in love with me?" said Zora in the same even tone. Yes, said Cypher. That's why he married your sister. Do you know why, in the depths of his heart, he sent me the tale of the little dog? He knew somehow that it was right. I believe it was. I tell you I'm superstitious, but in what absolute way it was right, I can't imagine. I can, said Zora. He knew that my place was by your side. He knew that I cared for you more than for any man alive. She paused. Then she said deliberately, He knew that I loved you all the time. Cypher plucked the illustrated paper from her hand and cast it across the room, and bending over the arm of his chair, seized her wrist. Zora, do you mean that? She nodded, fluttered a glance at him, and put out her free hand to claim a few moments' grace. I left you to look for a mission in life. I've come back and found it at the place I started from. It's a big mission, for it means being a mate to a big man. But if you will let me try, I'll do my best. Cypher thrust away the protecting hand. You can talk afterwards, he said. Thus did Zora come to the knowledge of things real. When the gates were opened, she walked in with a tread not wanting in magnificence. She made the great surrender, which is woman's greatest victory, very proudly, very humbly, very deliciously. She had her greatnesses. She freed herself, flushed and trembling, throbbing with a strange happiness that caught her breath. This time she believed nature, and laughed with her in her heart in close companionship. She was mere woman after all, with no mission in life but the accomplishment of her womanhood, and she gloried in the knowledge. This was exceedingly good for her. Cypher regarded her with shining eyes as if she had been an immortal, vesting herself in human clay for divine love of him. And this was exceedingly good for Cypher. After much hyperbole, they descended to kindly commonplace. But I don't see now, he cried, how I can ask you to marry me. I don't even know how I am to earn my living. There are Septimus's inventions. Have you lost your faith in them? He cried with sudden enthusiasm, as one who should say, if an immortal has faith in them, then indeed must they be divine. Do you believe in them now? Utterly. I've grown superstitious too. Wherever we turn, there is Septimus. He has raised Emmy from hell to heaven. He has brought us two together. He is our guardian angel. He'll never fail us. Oh, Clem, thank heaven, she exclaimed fervently. I've got something to believe in at last. Meanwhile, the guardian angel, entirely unconscious of apotheosis, sat in the little flat in Chelsea, blissfully eating crumpets, over which Emmy had spread the preposterous amount of butter which proceeds from an overflowing heart. She knelt on the hearthrug watching him adoringly, as if he were a hierophant eating sacramental wafer. They talked of the future. He mentioned the nice houses he had seen in Berkeley Square. Berkeley Square would be very charming, said Emmy, but it would mean carriages and motor cars and powdered footmen and ascot and balls and dinner parties and presentations at court. You would be just in your element, wouldn't you, dear? She laughed and laid her happy head on his knee. No, dear, if we want to have a fling together, you and I, in London, let us keep on this flat as a pied-à-terre. But let us live at Nunsmere. The home is quite big enough, and if it isn't, you can always add on a bit at the cost of a month's rent in Berkeley Square. Wouldn't you prefer to live at Nunsmere? You and the boy and my workshop are all I want in the world, said he. And not Wiggleswick? One of his rare smiles passed across his face. I think Wiggleswick will be upset. Emmy laughed again. What a funny household it will be. Wiggleswick and Madame Bolivar. It'll be lovely. Septimus reflected for an anxious moment. Do you know, dear, he said diffidently, I've dreamed of something all my life. I mean, ever since I left home. It has always seemed somehow beyond my reach. I wonder whether it can come true now. So many wonderful things have happened to me that perhaps this, too. What is it, dear? she asked very softly. "I seem to be marked off from other men, but I've dreamed all my life of having in my house a neat, proper, real parlour-maid in a pretty white cap and apron. Do you think it can be managed?" With her head on his knee, she said in a queer voice, "Yes, I think it can." He touched her cheek and suddenly drew his hand away. "Why, you're crying. What a selfish brute I am. Of course we won't have her if she would be in your way." Emmy lifted her face to him. "Oh, you dear, beautiful, silly Septimus," she said. "Don't you understand? Isn't it just like you? You give everyone else the earth, and in return you ask for a parlour-maid." "Well, you see," he said in a tone of distressed apology, "she would come in so handy. I could teach her to mind the guns." "You dear," cried Emmy. End of chapter 23. End of Septimus by William John Locke.